Hello friends, welcome to Story Time. Today, we're going to look at a psychological horror movie released in 2023 called Cobweb. Imagine lying in bed at night in complete darkness when you suddenly hear a soft knock coming from inside your bedroom wall. But when you tell your parents about it, they don't believe you and insist it's just your imagination. What if the thing inside the wall starts talking back to you and tells you that your own parents are actually monsters? The movie begins with an 8-year-old boy named Peter. Peter is a lonely and quiet child who gets bullied at school almost every day. He has no friends, and his home life isn't much better. His parents, Carol and Mark, appear kind and caring on the surface, but something about them feels deeply unsettling. They are extremely overprotective, strict, and sometimes seem more like prison guards than loving parents. One night, as Peter tries to fall asleep, he hears a strange tapping sound coming from the wall beside his bed. The tapping is so persistent that it almost sounds as though something is trying to break through. Terrified, Peter rushes to his parents and tells them about the noise. Instead of comforting him, Carol takes him back to his room and insists that it's all in his imagination. The following day at school, a new substitute teacher named Miss Devine introduces herself to the class. While the other students head outside for recess, Peter stays behind. Curious, Miss Devine asks why he isn't outside with the others, but Peter simply says that he doesn't like recess. Suddenly, a spider appears, startling Peter, but Miss Devine helps him get rid of it. The two then spend a few minutes talking and begin to get to know each other. Later that evening, while having dinner with his parents, Peter asks why they never allow him to go trick-or-treating on Halloween. Mark pauses for a moment before telling him about a little girl who disappeared several years earlier while out trick-or-treating. He says that ever since that incident, they have been too afraid to let Peter go outside on Halloween. That night, Peter hears the strange noises coming from the walls again. As he listens more closely, the scratching slowly turns into someone whispering his name. Frightened, Peter screams and Mark rushes into the room. Peter explains what he heard, but after checking the walls, Mark dismisses it as nothing more than rats. The next morning, Mark places rat poison around the house to deal with the supposed infestation. As he does, Peter notices that the poison has a strong smell of cinnamon. Later, the scene shifts to Peter's classroom, where the students are painting. Miss Devine notices that Peter has drawn a picture of a child asking for help. Concerned by the disturbing drawing, she decides to visit his home. When Miss Devine arrives, she asks Carol if Peter is doing okay and shows her the drawing. The moment Carol sees it, her expression changes, but she quickly regains her composure. She claims that Peter simply has a vivid imagination and that the drawing doesn't mean anything. After thanking Miss Devine for her concern, she quietly closes the door. Once Miss Devine leaves, Carol confronts Peter about the drawing. Peter brushes it off, insisting that it's just a drawing and nothing more. That night, the tapping behind the wall turns into the soft whisper of a young girl. This time, Peter isn't as frightened. Instead, he gathers the courage to speak with the mysterious voice. The girl introduces herself as Sarah, and the two begin talking. Things take a darker turn at school when a boy named Brian bullies Peter on the playground and destroys the pumpkin he painted. Heartbroken, Peter returns home and lies on his bed in tears. Hearing him cry, Sarah asks what happened. After Peter tells her about Brian, she encourages him to stop being afraid and make Brian fear him instead. The following day, Brian surprises Peter by bringing him a new pumpkin and apologizing for what he did. But influenced by Sarah's words, Peter takes things much further. After class, he follows Brian and pushes him down a flight of stairs, breaking his leg. As a result, Peter is suspended from school. That evening, Mark and Carol question Peter about his violent behavior. During the conversation, Carol tells Mark about Peter's disturbing drawing. Furious, Mark decides that Peter needs to be taught a lesson. He pushes the refrigerator aside, revealing a hidden door that leads to the basement. Mark and Carol force Peter downstairs before locking the heavy door behind him. The following morning, Miss Devine visits Peter's house to return his math test paper. Mark politely invites her inside for a cup of coffee, but the unsettling atmosphere inside the house immediately puts her on edge. She asks if she can see Peter, but Mark and Carol insist that he's fine and explain that he's simply grounded. Meanwhile, Peter hears Miss Devine's voice and desperately begins banging on the basement door. Luckily for Mark and Carol, the sound is drowned out by the washing machine. As Miss Devine prepares to leave, the washing machine suddenly stops. Now she can clearly hear someone pounding on the basement door. Alarmed, she asks Mark about the noise, but he casually claims it's just the washing machine before quickly escorting her outside. As Miss Devine tries to start her car, she realizes she can't find her keys. Just then, Mark suddenly appears beside her and hands them back, leaving her even more uneasy. Later that night, Mark and Carol finally let Peter out of the basement. They insist that everything they do is for his own good. Peter asks if he can return to school, but Carol tells him that she'll be teaching him at home from now on. Unable to sleep after everything that has happened, Peter quietly calls out to Sarah through the wall, hoping she'll answer. Concerned, Sarah asks where he has been. Peter tells her everything that happened and explains that his parents locked him in the basement. After a brief silence, he asks if there is any way he can see her. Sarah tells him to look behind the peeling wallpaper. Hidden beneath it, Peter discovers a tiny hole in the wall. Slowly, he leans closer and peers through it. On the other side, a pair of pale, terrifying eyes suddenly stares directly back at him. Startled, Peter jumps back and demands to know who she is. Sarah finally reveals that she is his sister. She explains that their parents have kept her imprisoned inside the walls for years. Sarah warns Peter that Mark and Carol are not the loving parents they pretend to be. Instead, she tells him that they are dangerous and that he should be afraid of them. Horrified by what he has just learned, Peter rushes back to his bed and hides beneath the blankets, too frightened to look toward the wall again. Sarah then reveals an even darker secret. She tells Peter that their parents once murdered a little girl after she accidentally discovered Sarah and tried to help her escape. To hide the crime, they buried the girl's body in the backyard. The next day, determined to find out if Sarah is telling the truth, Peter quietly digs at the spot she described. To his horror, he uncovers a human skull buried beneath the soil. Terrified, Peter stumbles backward just as Carol notices him and rushes into the backyard. Panicking, Peter quickly covers the hole with dirt. When Carol reaches him and demands to know what he's doing, he lies and says that he was only looking for a pumpkin. After discovering what his parents have supposedly done, Peter decides that he has to rescue Sarah and escape with her. He suddenly remembers that Miss Devine wrote her phone number on his math test, so he decides to call her for help. While his parents are distracted, Peter quietly sneaks into their bedroom and dials Miss Devine's number. However, before he can say a single word, Carol catches him. A few moments later, Miss Devine calls back. Carol answers the phone and calmly lies, saying that Peter only called because he misses his teacher but is too shy to speak. She then ends the call before Miss Devine can ask any questions. Carol drags Peter back to his room. As she enters, her eyes immediately fall on the small hole in the wall. The color drains from her face. Realizing that Sarah has spoken to him, Carol furiously demands to know what she said. Without waiting for an answer, she rushes into another room and locks the door. Later that night, Sarah whispers to Peter once again. She tells him that she overheard their parents talking and believes they are planning to kill her. Alarmed, Peter quietly sneaks out of his room and heads downstairs. He finds Mark and Carol having a serious conversation. Just as he tries to listen more closely, Carol notices him. Realizing he's been caught, Peter quickly hurries back to his bedroom and pretends to be asleep before his parents arrive. The following day, Brian, still furious over what Peter did to him, arrives at Peter's house with his cousins, determined to get revenge. That evening, the family sits down for dinner. As they begin eating, Mark suddenly asks Carol if she added anything different to the soup. Carol says she didn't but notices that it smells strongly of cinnamon. Growing suspicious, Mark looks at Peter and realizes that his bowl is still untouched. Furious, Mark demands to know what Peter has done. Looking directly at him, Peter quietly replies, "You hurt my sister." The horrifying truth immediately becomes clear. Peter has poisoned the soup using the rat poison. Mark orders Carol to call for help. But when she grabs the phone, she discovers that Peter has already cut the phone line. Moments later, Mark begins vomiting blood before collapsing to the floor. Terrified and consumed by rage, Carol grabs a kitchen knife and charges toward Peter. Peter runs upstairs as fast as he can, but Carol manages to grab his leg. Before she can reach him, the poison begins taking effect. She starts vomiting blood and grows weaker with every passing second. Desperate to escape, Peter kicks Carol away. She tumbles down the staircase and accidentally falls onto the knife. Shaken, Peter carefully approaches her body and removes the keys from her hand so he can finally rescue Sarah. With her last bit of strength, Carol grabs Peter's wrist and desperately warns him not to let Sarah out. Ignoring the warning, Peter rushes toward a room with a large grandfather clock. Sarah's voice echoes through the wall, asking if he has found the keys. When Peter says yes, she tells him to move the clock. Struggling with all his strength, Peter pushes the heavy clock aside and discovers a small hidden door behind it. As soon as he unlocks the door, Sarah's gentle voice suddenly changes into something horrifying and inhuman. Terrified, Peter runs back to his bedroom and locks himself inside. Moments later, Sarah finally escapes. Years of isolation have transformed her into a horrifying creature with long, spider-like limbs and tangled hair that trails across the floor. Crawling on all fours, she effortlessly scales the walls and ceiling like a giant spider. She slowly approaches Peter and finally reveals the truth. Sarah admits that she was the one who murdered the little girl who tried to help her years ago. She confesses that she manipulated Peter from the very beginning because her real goal was to take revenge on the parents who kept her imprisoned for so many years. Suddenly, Brian and his cousins break into Peter's house with baseball bats, believing they're only there to scare a little boy. But what awaits them inside is far beyond anything they could have imagined. As soon as they enter, they begin smashing furniture and searching the house for Peter. Meanwhile, Sarah moves silently through the walls like a shadow, stalking the intruders one by one. Using her unnatural strength and terrifying speed, she brutally kills them without giving them a chance to fight back. Brian suddenly steps on something slippery and loses his footing. Looking down, he realizes he has stepped into a pool of blood. Before he can even react, Sarah appears behind him and brutally kills him as well. After dealing with the intruders, Sarah walks into Peter's room and tells him how cruelly their parents treated her simply because she was born with a severely deformed face. She then drags Peter out of the room and locks him inside a metal cage. A short while later, Miss Devine arrives at the house, still worried about Peter's strange phone call. The moment she steps inside, she sees the house in complete disarray. Alarmed, she reaches for the phone to call for help, but before she can do so, Sarah suddenly attacks her. Miss Devine narrowly escapes and runs toward the front door. Just then, she hears Peter desperately calling for help. Following his voice, she reaches Peter's room. Before Sarah can get inside, Miss Devine slams the door shut and blocks it with everything she can find. Realizing there is no other way to reach Peter, she begins smashing through the wall. At the same time, Sarah unlocks the cage and slowly moves toward Peter. Just as Sarah is about to reach him, Miss Devine breaks through the wall, pulls Peter to safety, and the two run toward the front door. However, before Peter can escape, Sarah suddenly grabs him and drags him back into the house. She throws him into a deep pit covered by a heavy iron grate and finally reveals her horrifying face to him. Determined not to give up, Miss Devine enters the house once again and calls out for Peter. Following his voice, she makes her way into the basement, where Sarah launches another vicious attack. Meanwhile, Peter notices that Sarah's long hair is still hanging down into the pit. Seeing his only chance to escape, he grabs hold of it and carefully climbs out. Once Peter reaches the top, he rushes to help Miss Devine. Working together, they manage to force Sarah back into the pit before slamming the heavy iron grate shut and locking it, trapping her once again. Believing the nightmare is finally over, Peter and Miss Devine slowly make their way out of the house. But just as they are about to leave, Sarah's voice echoes from the darkness. She whispers to Peter that no matter where he goes, she will always be a part of him. Then she promises that one day she will escape again and be waiting for him in the shadows. With Sarah's haunting words echoing in Peter's mind, the movie comes to a chilling end. Thank you for watching.